Hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Whispered Lore. Settle in now and allow the quiet of the evening to envelop you. Tonight we begin a gentle exploration, a study we call the Wooden Walls. We will drift back to the age of sail to consider the immense, slow-moving logistics of naval timber. From the careful selection of ancient oaks in hushed, sprawling forests, to their arduous journey to the shipyards where master craftsmen waited, there is no need to hold on to every fact. Simply let the calm, methodical details of history wash over you, a gentle current to carry you towards sleep. The Age of Sail, a period stretching loosely from the 16th to the mid-19th century, is often recalled through the spectacle of naval combat, the billowing canvas of a full-rigged ship, or the grand strategies of admirals. Yet beneath this romantic veneer lies a more fundamental story, a narrative not of cannon fire and glory, but of wood, iron, and immense logistical effort. This is the story of the Wooden Walls, the great fleets of warships that defined the era, and more specifically, the story of their creation. For every ship that sailed the world's oceans was, first and foremost, a product of the land. It was a carefully assembled ecosystem of timber, a floating forest, harvested, transported, and shaped by a vast and intricate industrial machine. The power of a nation was not merely measured by the number of ships in its navy, but by its access to and command of the sylvan resources required to build and maintain them. This series, The Wooden Walls, will examine this foundational reality. We will explore the journey of the ship from a seedling in a distant forest to a completed vessel of war sliding down the slipway into the water. We will focus on the two critical and interconnected elements of this process, the sourcing of naval timber and the complex logistics of the shipyard. It is a study in forestry, in engineering, in economics, and in the sheer, brute force organization of pre-industrial states. The primary material, the very substance of naval power, was wood. But not just any wood. The construction of a single ship of the line, the capital ship of its day, was a uniquely demanding enterprise. A first-rate, a vessel carrying 100 guns or more, such as His Majesty's Ship Victory, required the felling of approximately 6,000 mature trees. The majority of these, perhaps as many as 90%, were oak. The specific species, primarily English oak, Quercus robur, or its close relative, sessile oak, Quercus petrea, were prized for their exceptional properties. The wood is dense, hard, and remarkably strong, capable of withstanding the immense stresses of wind and wave, and the percussive shock of its own cannons firing a broadside. Furthermore, the high concentration of tannic acid within its cellular structure rendered it highly resistant to rot and the insidious work of marine organisms like the Teredo navalis, the shipworm. The search for suitable oak was a national strategic priority. The ideal tree was not one grown in a dense, competitive forest, which would produce a tall, straight, and slender trunk. While such timber had its uses, the true prizes were the trees grown in open parkland or hedgerows. These, grown, timbers, exposed to light and wind from all sides, developed a different character. They were shorter, broader, and most importantly, their branches grew into thick, organically curved shapes. A ship is a thing of curves. Its hull, its internal framing, its supporting structures are all composed of complex, non-linear forms. To construct these, shipwrights could either laminate or steam bend smaller, straight pieces of timber, a weaker and less durable solution, or they could find a tree that had already grown into the required shape. This latter resource was known as compass timber. The procurement of compass timber was an art in itself. Surveyors, employed by the Navy or by private contractors, would scour the countryside, their eyes trained to see not just a tree, but the component parts of a ship hidden within its form. A large, sweeping branch might be identified as a potential knee, a critical L-shaped bracket that connected a deck beam to the ship's frame. A forked trunk could be envisioned as a breast hook, the V-shaped timber that reinforced the bow. The base of the tree, where the trunk met the root system, yielded the most valuable pieces of all, the great curving floor timbers that formed the very bottom of the ship's skeleton, its transverse frames. The story of the wooden warship is, in its most fundamental essence, the story of a tree, not just any tree, but a specific genus, possessed of a unique confluence of properties that made it the singular material of choice for the construction of naval power for centuries. This is the story of oak, and more specifically, the English oak, Quercus robur, and its close relative, the sessile oak, Quercus petrea. To understand the ship, one must first understand the timber. One must begin in the quiet of the ancient forest, where the slow, patient processes of biology forged the material that would come to dominate the world's oceans. The preeminence of oak was not a matter of mere tradition or convenience, but of complex structural and chemical science, understood by shipwrights through generations of empirical observation. At a microscopic level, the cellular structure of oak provides the first clues to its suitability. The wood is dense, composed of thick-walled cells tightly packed together. Crucially, it possesses prominent medullary rays, cellular structures that radiate outwards from the center of the tree like the spokes of a wheel. In many woods, these rays are fine and indistinct. In oak, they are large and plate-like, acting as a form of natural reinforcement, binding the annual growth rings together and providing exceptional resistance to splitting and shearing forces. When a cannonball struck the side of an oak-hulled ship, this interwoven structure helped to absorb and dissipate the kinetic energy, often resulting in a localized gouge or a shower of splinters, rather than a catastrophic structural failure that might occur with a more brittle timber. Beyond this physical toughness, oak heartwood contains a feature known as tyloses. These are balloon-like growths of adjacent parenchyma cells that protrude into the vessel elements or pores of the wood. As the living sapwood slowly transitions into the dead structural heartwood, these tyloses effectively plug the tree's vascular system. The result is a wood that is remarkably impervious to water penetration. While the outer layers might become saturated, the core remains comparatively dry. This single characteristic was of paramount importance for a vessel intended to spend its entire life immersed in water. It drastically slowed the onset of rot, the insidious decay caused by fungal attack that was the constant enemy of every wooden ship. The chemistry of oak provided a second, equally potent line of defense. Oak is rich in tannic acid, a complex mixture of polyphenolic compounds. These tannins serve a biological purpose for the living tree, deterring insects and inhibiting fungal growth. In the felled timber, this property persisted. The high concentration of tannins made the wood unpalatable to many wood-boring organisms and actively fought the very fungi that sought to decompose it. This innate resistance to decay meant that an oak-built ship, properly maintained, could endure decades of service in the most hostile marine environments. The shipworm, or Teredo navalis, in reality a saltwater clam which could riddle a softer timber with a honeycomb of destructive tunnels in a matter of months, found oak to be a far less hospitable medium. The tannins, however, were a double-edged sword. Their acidic nature was highly corrosive to iron. Any iron fastenings, the bolts, nails, and spikes used to hold the ship together, would rapidly rust and degrade when in direct contact with the damp oak. This necessitated the use of more expensive copper or bronze fastenings below the waterline, or the laborious practice of isolating iron bolts from the wood with wrappings of tarred canvas. It was a chemical compromise, a problem to be engineered around, but one that was deemed acceptable in exchange for the timber's overwhelming advantages. The selection of the perfect timber, however, began long before the shipwright laid his adze to the wood. The operational capacity of the Royal Navy, the very instrument of British maritime supremacy, was predicated upon a resource both fundamental and finite: timber. The preceding examination of domestic woodlands has illustrated the immense pressures placed upon the oak forests of England and Wales, a strain that by the late 17th and early 18th centuries had begun to reveal the quantitative limitations of a purely national supply chain. The inexorable demand for timber, driven by the constant cycle of construction, repair, and the inevitable losses of war and weather, necessitated a fundamental expansion of the Navy Board's procurement horizons. The British forest was no longer sufficient. It was necessary to conceive of and to exploit a global forest. This chapter concerns the intricate, often precarious, and always complex systems developed to source naval timber from beyond the shores of Britain. The primary and most vital overseas source of timber was, for a considerable period, the vast forested hinterland of the Baltic Sea. The regions of Prussia, Poland, and Livonia, accessed through ports such as Danzig, Memel, and Riga, offered a quality and scale of timber that was increasingly scarce in Britain. The Baltic did not, for the most part, supply the great curved compass timbers or the immense oak heartwoods required for the primary structural members of a ship of the line. English oak, particularly from the southern counties, remained the material of choice for frames, futtocks, and keels. Instead, the Baltic provided two other essential categories of naval stores. First was oak planking, particularly from the area around Danzig, which was renowned for its quality. This, Danzig crown planking, was straight-grained, relatively free of knots, and well suited for the outer skin of the hull and for decking. The trade was highly organized, with felled oak logs being transported down river systems like the Vistula, often for hundreds of miles, to the coastal ports where they were sawn and graded by timber merchants under contract to the Navy Board or its agents. The process was slow, governed by the seasons. Felling took place in winter, when the sap was down, and the frozen ground and waterways facilitated the movement of the heavy logs. The spring thaw would then carry the timber rafts downstream to the waiting ships. The second, and arguably more critical resource from the Baltic, was mast timber. The native pines of Britain, such as the Scots pine, could not produce the single, straight, immense trunks required for the lower masts and bowsprits of the largest first-rate and second-rate warships. These vessels required masts well over 100 feet in length and 3 feet in diameter at their base. For this, the Navy turned to the towering Riga and Norway spruce and fir trees that grew in the cold northern forests. Riga, in modern-day Latvia, became the preeminent port for the export of these great masts. The procurement of these timbers was a specialized undertaking. They had to be carefully selected while still standing, felled with immense skill to prevent shattering, and then laboriously transported, often by teams of dozens of oxen, to the nearest floatable river. The geopolitical implications of this reliance were profound. The Baltic trade routes passed through the narrow Danish Sound, where tolls were levied and were vulnerable to the political whims of rival powers. During periods of conflict, such as the Napoleonic Wars and the formation of the League of Armed Neutrality, the interruption of the Baltic timber supply represented a strategic crisis for the Admiralty, prompting diplomatic maneuvering and, at times, direct military intervention to secure the vital flow of masts, planking, and naval stores, like pitch and tar. While the Baltic provided the bulk of imported timber, another, more distant forest beckoned with a promise of even grander resources. The story of the wooden warship is, in its most fundamental sense, the story of the tree. Not merely any tree, but specific trees, of specific species, grown in specific ways, and harvested under a system of immense geopolitical consequence. Central to this system, a symbol of its reach and its ambition, was a simple mark, an ideogram of power impressed upon wood, the king's broad arrow. This mark, a vertical line topped by two angled barbs, resembling an arrowhead, was an ancient symbol of crown property in England. Its application to timber, however, signified a critical evolution in statecraft and naval strategy. It was a declaration that the tree upon which it was carved no longer belonged to the landowner, nor to the colonist who discovered it, but to the British crown, reserved exclusively for the use of the Royal Navy. This chapter explores the genesis of this policy, its implementation, its profound political ramifications, and its role in shaping the sinews of maritime power during the Age of Sail. To comprehend the necessity of the broad arrow, one must first comprehend the material demands of a single ship of the line. A 74-gun third-rate vessel, the workhorse of the Royal Navy in the latter half of the 18th century, required approximately 3,000 mature oak trees for its construction. Some estimates place this number closer to 4,000, representing the timber from over 50 acres of managed woodland. This was not simply a matter of quantity. The quality and, most importantly, the shape of the timber were paramount. The primary structural material was English oak, specifically Quercus robur and Quercus petrea. Its dense, interlocking grain, rich in tannic acids, provided unparalleled strength and resistance to rot. The keel, the great spinal column of the ship, was fashioned from the longest, straightest, and most flawless oak trunks available. The massive frames, the ribs of the vessel, demanded a different form of timber altogether. These were not sawn into curves, but were sourced from trees that had grown naturally into the required shapes. These were known as compass timbers. The great arching branches and the junction of root and trunk, known as the knee, were meticulously sought out by naval surveyors. Each curved futtock, each L-shaped knee was a unique and irreplaceable component, its grain following the curve of the timber, providing a structural integrity that no assembly of straight planks could replicate. The sourcing of this compass timber was a specialized and increasingly difficult task, as centuries of shipbuilding had depleted the most ideally shaped trees from England's forests. While oak formed the hull and frame, another type of tree was equally vital, the tall, straight conifers required for masts and spars. A first-rate ship like HMS Victory required a mainmast that was a complex assembly of multiple trees, soaring over 200 feet from the deck. Such a structure had to be immensely strong to carry tons of sail and rigging, yet flexible enough to withstand the violent forces of a gale. For this purpose, no timber was superior to the Scots pine of the Baltic region, particularly from Riga, and, later, the eastern white pine, Pinus strobus of North America. These trees grew to prodigious heights with minimal taper, yielding single, straight spars of a size and quality unavailable in the British Isles. The strategic problem was one of supply. The ancient royal forests of England, such as the Forest of Dean and the New Forest, were under increasing pressure not only from the shipyards, but from charcoal production for iron smelting, domestic fuel needs, and agricultural clearance. Private woodlands were being felled at an unsustainable rate. The reliance on Baltic pine for masts, meanwhile, placed the Royal Navy in a precarious position. The expansion of naval power in the 17th and 18th centuries was predicated on a resource both plentiful and yet paradoxically finite: timber. The great ships of the line, the frigates, the sloops of war, were not mere constructs of wood. They were complex, organic entities, each a floating ecosystem of carefully selected, shaped, and seasoned timber. The demand for this material, particularly for the strong, resilient heart of the English oak, Quercus robur, or its continental counterpart, Quercus petrea, grew at a rate that far outstripped the natural regeneration of Europe's ancient forests. The traditional practice of simply identifying and felling suitable trees in royal forests, on crown lands, or through compulsory purchase from private estates became increasingly untenable. This reactive approach, a form of hunter-gathering for the raw materials of sea power, was leading to a crisis of supply. The great woodlands, which for centuries had been viewed as an inexhaustible reserve, were showing signs of depletion. The very foundation of maritime supremacy was at risk of decaying, not from enemy cannon, but from a simple, inexorable shortage of the right kind of wood. It was from this dawning realization that a new philosophy of resource management was born. This was the dawn of naval forestry, a systematic, long-term, and profoundly ambitious attempt to cultivate a fleet from the soil itself. The problem was one of extreme specificity. A shipyard did not simply require wood. It required wood of particular species, age, size, and most critically, shape. The primary structural skeleton of a wooden warship, its frame, was composed of a series of massive, curved ribs. These ribs, or frames, were themselves assembled from smaller, interlocking curved sections known as futtocks. To these were added the great floor timbers, the deck beams with their supporting knees, and the complex multi-part structures of the stem and sternpost. For these components, a straight log was of little use. To cut such a curve from a large, straight piece of timber would be to cut across the grain, creating a point of inherent weakness, a fatal flaw in the ship's anatomy. The ideal solution was to find a tree, or more specifically, a large branch or trunk section that had naturally grown into the required curve. This was known as compass timber, or crooked timber, the most prized and scarcest of all naval resources. Foresters and purveyors would spend weeks traversing woodlands in search of these natural shapes, a gnarled oak limb that perfectly matched the shipwright's template for a first futtock, or a curving trunk base, ideal for a forward breasthook. A single 74-gun ship of the line required approximately 3,000 mature oak trees, a significant portion of which needed to be of this specific, naturally curved character. These trees needed to be of immense size and age, often over 100 years old, to provide timbers of the necessary thickness or scantling, and to possess a sufficient volume of dense, rot-resistant heartwood. The outer sapwood was useless for structural purposes. As the easily accessible forests were cleared of their most promising specimens, the search for compass timber became more desperate, and the prices soared. It was in this climate of impending scarcity that the concept of silviculture, the deliberate management of forest growth, was adapted for naval purposes. The French were among the pioneers of this strategic approach. Under the direction of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's brilliant minister of finance, the Great Forest Ordinance of 1669 was promulgated. This was a comprehensive legal framework for the management and exploitation of French forests, with a clear and explicit priority given to the needs of the Navy. The ordinance dictated everything from felling schedules to replanting quotas. The journey of a great ship of the line, a wooden wall of the Royal Navy, does not begin in the clamor of the shipyard. It does not begin with the laying of the keel or the lofting of the plans. It begins here, in the deep quiet of an ancient forest, with a single, immense tree. For 200, perhaps 300 years, this English oak, Quercus robur, has stood. Its life has been a slow, silent accumulation of mass, a patient conversion of sunlight, water, and soil into the dense, interlocking fibers of its heartwood. Now its long vigil is to end, and a new purpose is to be conferred upon it. The process is initiated not by an act of brute force, but by one of careful, considered selection. Through these woods walks the purveyor of timber, a man whose eye is trained to see not a tree, but the component parts of a vessel. He is not merely looking for size, for simple bulk. He is hunting for shapes. His gaze follows the sweep of a great limb, and in its curve, he visualizes a futtock, one of the curved ribs that will form the ship's skeleton. He assesses the juncture of a massive branch with the main trunk, seeing in its natural, right-angled growth the immense strength of a knee, a critical structural bracket that will resist the racking forces of the sea. Straight, unblemished sections of the lower trunk are mentally cataloged for planking, for beams, for the keel itself. This is a form of living geometry. The tree has spent centuries growing into the shapes the shipwright requires, and it is the purveyor's task to recognize and claim this natural architecture. Once a tree is deemed suitable, it is marked. The symbol is unambiguous. the king's broad arrow, a simple, three-lined mark scored deep into the bark. This blaze declares the tree as property of the crown, reserved for the exclusive use of the Admiralty. It is a mark of appropriation, a formal notice that this giant's destiny is now tied to the defense of the realm. The felling itself is a seasonal activity, dictated by the silent, internal rhythms of the tree. The work is best undertaken in the late autumn or winter, after the leaves have fallen and before the sap begins to rise in the spring. In this dormant period, the tree's moisture content is at its lowest. The timber, once felled, will be less susceptible to the fungal decay and insect infestation that thrive in the sugar-rich sapwood of a tree cut in its prime of growth. A winter-felled oak will season more evenly, with less tendency to split, crack, or warp, and so the fellers wait for the cold, for the damp stillness of the winter woods. The felling crew is a small, specialized team. They are not lumberjacks in the modern sense. They are craftsmen whose medium is the standing tree. Their tools are few, but they are perfectly suited to their task. The primary instrument is the felling axe. It is a long-handled tool with a relatively narrow, heavy head or pole, designed to bite deep into the wood, chopping out large chips with each swing. Its edge is maintained with a whetstone to a razorous sharpness. Accompanying the axe is the great crosscut saw, a long, flexible blade of steel, often 6 or 7 feet in length, with a wooden handle at each end. Its teeth are arranged in a specific pattern. A series of cutter teeth, which score the edges of the cut, are followed by a raker tooth, which is set lower and acts as a small chisel to clear the wood from the channel or kerf. This saw is a 2-man engine, powered by a steady, rhythmic cooperation. Finally, there are the iron wedges and the heavy wooden mallets, known as beetles, used to drive them. The work begins with a clearing of the area around the base of the tree. Underbrush is cut away, and a clear path of retreat is established for the fellers. The direction of the tree's fall is not left to chance. The felling is complete. The sharp, resonant reports of axes and the rhythmic sighing of the great crosscut saws have fallen silent. In their place, a different soundscape begins to emerge, one characterized by the dull thud of cant hooks, the jingle of harness chains, and the low, patient exhortations of men. The forest, once a vertical domain of canopy and shadow, is now a horizontal work site, a cluttered tableau of immense, recumbent forms. Here, on the needle-strewn floor, begins the second and in many ways more arduous phase of the naval timber enterprise, the journey from the stump to the water's edge. This is the story of the great timber haul, a logistical ballet of brute force, mechanical ingenuity, and an intimate understanding of terrain and season. Once a tree was on the ground, its transformation from a singular botanical entity into a series of manageable, purpose-driven components commenced. The first of these procedures was known as bucking, the process of cross-cutting the main trunk or bole into predetermined lengths. This was not an arbitrary division. Each length was measured with exacting precision, corresponding to the specific requirements of the shipyard. A 40-foot section for a keelson, a shorter, thicker piece for a futtock, or a long, straight-grained log destined to be sawn into planking. The 2-man crosscut saw, the same tool used for felling, was again employed. Sawyers would find their purchase on or beside the log, one man on each end of the long, flexible blade. Their movements were a study in practiced economy, a steady push and pull, each stroke clearing a kerf of pale, fragrant sawdust that would accumulate in soft piles. The sound was a continuous, rasping whisper, a metronome marking the slow division of the whole into its constituent parts. For certain timbers, particularly the great oaks destined to become the primary structural frames of a ship, another process took place in the forest itself, hewing. A round log is an inefficient shape for transport and an unusable one for construction. By squaring the log into a balk or cant, its weight was significantly reduced, and it gained flat, stable sides making it easier to stack and handle. This was the work of the broadaxe man, a craftsman of considerable skill. First, the log was scored at intervals along its length with a felling axe, the cuts marking the depth of the desired flat plane. Then, using a chalk line snapped between 2 points, a straight guide was established. The hewer, standing atop the log, would use his adze to chop away notches between the score marks. Finally, with the broadaxe, an implement with a wide, single-beveled blade and an offset handle, he would split away the remaining wood in long, satisfying slabs, leaving a remarkably flat and even surface. This process was repeated on 2 or 4 sides, depending on the specification. The forest floor around these operations became littered with these pale, curved slabs, a testament to the conversion of organic form into geometric utility. With the logs bucked and, where necessary, hewn, the initial and most difficult phase of movement began: skidding. This was the act of dragging the timber from the felling site to a collection point, or landing, where it could be loaded onto more substantial transport. The distances were often short, perhaps only a few hundred yards, but the terrain was invariably hostile. The primary movers were draft animals, predominantly teams of oxen. While horses were faster, oxen were preferred for this initial stage. Their strength was immense and, crucially, steady. They could maintain a slow, powerful pull for hours, were less excitable, and their splayed hooves afforded them better purchase on uneven, soft ground. A team of 4, 6, or even 8 oxen would be brought to the head of the log. The felling is complete. The great boles of oak, pine, and elm lie stripped and silent in the high forests, monuments to the labor of the timber gangs, but their intrinsic value, their potential to become the curved ribs and stout planking of a naval vessel, remains unrealized. Between the stump in the remote hinterland and the saw pit of the coastal shipyard lies a critical and arduous transition, a journey almost exclusively undertaken upon the surfaces of water. This is the story of that transit, a complex logistical ballet of gravity, current, and human ingenuity, where the raw material of sea power began its slow, often treacherous, pilgrimage to the sea. The journey commences not on a grand river, but in the shallow, rock-strewn headwaters and nascent tributaries that lace the forested uplands. Here, the water is often insufficient to float a single mature oak log, let alone a vast quantity of them. The initial movement, from the felling site to the nearest viable stream, was a brutish affair of oxen and sled, dragging the timber over rough-hewn corduroy roads. But once at the water's edge, a different set of principles took hold. The primary challenge was one of intermittent and inadequate flow. To overcome this, the river drivers and engineers constructed a device of simple yet profound effectiveness: the splash dam, or driving dam. This was not a permanent, monolithic structure, but a temporary barrier of cribbed logs packed with rock and earth, designed to hold back the stream's modest flow. Over a period of days, or even weeks, a sizable pond would form behind the dam. The felled timber, often hundreds of individual logs, was rolled into this artificial lake, awaiting its moment of release. The dam's sluice gate, a heavy timber gate known as the trip log, was held in place by a complex but crude trigger mechanism. When the reservoir was full and the downstream channel cleared, the trigger was released. With a low, resonant groan, the gate would give way, unleashing a controlled, artificial flood. This surge, a powerful head of water, would lift the mass of logs, carrying them over the shallow riffles, exposed rocks, and other impediments of the upper stream bed that would otherwise have stranded them indefinitely. This process would be repeated, a series of man-made freshets, leapfrogging the timber down the watershed from one holding point to the next. A slow and deliberate pulsation of water and wood. The men who oversaw this process, the river drivers, were a unique breed, possessing an intimate knowledge of the water's behavior and an uncanny sense of balance. Their primary tools were the cant hook and the peavey, simple implements of wood and iron designed to grip, lever, and roll the immense, unresponsive logs. Their work was to prevent jams, to keep the timber moving with the artificial current, wading into the frigid water to dislodge a snagged bowl, or darting across the shifting mass of moving wood with a confidence that belied the immense danger. Every log represented a significant capital investment, and its stranding or loss was a direct financial blow to the timber contractor. As the tributaries converged, feeding into a larger, more consistently navigable river, the nature of the transport changed. The need for splash dams diminished, replaced by the challenge of managing a far greater volume of timber over a much longer distance. The logs, now numbered in the thousands, could no longer be driven as a loose, chaotic mass. They had to be consolidated, organized, and controlled. This was the era of the great timber raft. The construction of a raft was a science in itself, a form of temporary, industrial carpentry performed on the surface of the water. The logs were first corralled in a quiet bend of the river. Then rafting crews, working from small skiffs, would begin the painstaking process of assembly. The intricate machinery of the Royal Navy, its power projected across the globe through the medium of its great wooden warships, was fundamentally dependent upon a resource that was at once commonplace and extraordinarily specific: oak timber. Yet the journey of this timber, from a living tree in a quiet English wood to a precisely shaped frame within the hull of a ship of the line, was a complex and often contentious process. It was a process mediated not by the direct action of the state, but through a vital, sprawling, and deeply commercial network of private individuals, the timber merchants. This chapter examines the relationship between these purveyors of the nation's most critical strategic material and the administrative body that governed its acquisition, the Admiralty, acting through its executive arm, the Navy Board. The Admiralty itself did not engage directly in the felling or purchasing of trees from landowners. Such an undertaking would have required a vast and unwieldy bureaucracy, ill-suited to the particularities of rural land ownership and the specialized knowledge of forestry. Instead, the Navy Board relied upon a class of middlemen, the timber merchants, who bridged the gap between the producer and the consumer. These were men of considerable capital and expertise. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the English and Welsh countryside, understanding which estates held promising stands of oak and which landowners might be persuaded to sell. They understood the complex logistics of felling, of seasoning, and, most critically, of transport. A merchant's success depended on his ability to identify, purchase, and deliver timber to the royal dockyards at a price that satisfied the Navy Board's stringent budgets, while still allowing for a viable profit margin. The primary instrument governing this relationship was the contract. The Navy Board would issue calls for tenders, specifying the quantities and types of timber required for the various dockyards at Deptford, Woolwich, Chatham, Sheerness, Portsmouth, and Plymouth. These requirements were extraordinarily detailed, reflecting the highly specialized needs of the shipwright. Contracts did not simply call for oak, they called for specific categories of timber. There was straight timber for planking and beams, compass timber, naturally curved pieces essential for the ship's frames or ribs, thick stuff, which were planks of exceptional thickness for the whales and other critical structural elements, and specialized pieces of unique shape and size for stems, sternposts, and knightheads. Each category was further broken down by minimum dimensions, or scantlings, and by quality. The ideal naval oak was slow-grown, close-grained, and entirely free of defects such as shakes, which are longitudinal cracks, or of any sign of rot, be it wet or dry. Upon securing a contract, the merchant's work truly began. He would dispatch his own agents or purveyors to survey timber, either standing or already felled. This survey was a critical skill. The purveyor had to assess the quality of the wood from external signs and, most importantly, Visualize the specific naval components that could be hewn from a particular log, or, in the case of compass timber, a curving limb. A single crooked branch useless for house construction might contain a perfectly shaped first, second, or third futtock for the frame of a 74-gun ship, making it immensely valuable. The merchant would negotiate a price with the landowner, pay for the labor of the woodcutters and sawyers, and then arrange for the immense challenge of transportation. The timber was first moved by horse-drawn timber carriages, wains of immense strength, along rudimentary rural tracks to the nearest navigable river. From there, it would be loaded onto barges or floated in great rafts downstream to coastal ports, and then transferred to seagoing vessels for the final journey to the designated royal dockyard. We arrive now at the heart of naval power, the Royal Shipyard. It is not merely a construction site, but a meticulously organized, self-contained industrial city, a nexus where raw material, human artistry, and strategic necessity converge. The anatomy of such a place is a study in logistics, a precisely orchestrated flow of matter and energy, all dedicated to a single monumental purpose: the creation of the wooden walls that formed the backbone of the fleet. The journey of a shipyard begins at its perimeter, most critically, at its interface with the water. The Great Water Gate, a formidable barrier of timber and iron, is the primary artery. Through it passes the lifeblood of the yard, the vast timber floats, rafts of colossal oak and elm logs, guided from the timber ships that have carried them from distant forests. These logs do not immediately meet the saw. Their first destination is the timber pond, or camber. Here, submerged in the brackish water, the timber is stored. This serves a dual purpose. It prevents the wood from drying too rapidly, which would lead to splitting and checking, and the saltwater immersion helps to leach out the sap and resins that attract marine boring worms, a process of preservation that begins long before the first adze strikes the wood. The ponds are a Forestry negative, a submerged catalog of future ship components, their massive forms dark and silent beneath the water's surface. From the ponds, the timber is heaved ashore, a task for powerful cranes and capstans, powered by teams of laborers. Once on land, it enters the next phase of its preparation: seasoning. The shipyard is dominated by the sight of immense timber stacks, arranged in long, orderly rows with deliberate gaps or channels between each plank and beam. This is not random storage. It is a carefully controlled process of air drying that can take years, even a decade, for the largest compass timbers destined for a first-rate ship's frame. Each stack is a patient monument to time, allowing the wood to slowly release its moisture, to settle into its final, stable dimensions. The air within these timber yards is thick, with the faint, resinous scent of pine and the sharp, tannic smell of oak, a constant olfactory reminder of the yard's fundamental material. When the timber is judged to be seasoned, its journey towards a specific function begins. The first and most physically demanding transformation occurs at the saw pits. These are deep, brick-lined trenches over which the great logs are positioned. The sawing is performed by a two-man team with a long pit saw. The top dog, the more senior of the two, stands on the log, guiding the saw's cut along a chalked line. Below him, in the pit, is the underdog, who pulls the saw downwards on its cutting stroke, showered in a constant rain of sawdust. It is relentless, repetitive, and profoundly strenuous work, the conversion of a rounded log into squared beams and flat planks, the basic grammar from which a ship of the line will be composed. Parallel to this raw conversion is the intellectual heart of the design process, the mold loft. This is typically one of the largest enclosed spaces in the shipyard, a vast, open building with a floor of pale, smooth wood kept immaculately clean. Here, the ship's plans, sent from the Admiralty as a series of intricate drawings, are translated into full-scale reality. Shipwrights, known as loftsmen, kneel upon the floor, using long, flexible battens and chalk lines to lay down the exact curvature of every frame, every beam, every knee of the proposed vessel. From these full-size drawings, they create thin wooden templates, or molds. These molds are the ship's genetic code, patterns that will be taken to the sawyers and shipwrights to ensure that every single one of the thousands of individual timber components is cut to the precise, required shape. The timber has arrived, pulled from the depths of ancient forests, floated downriver, and hauled into the sprawling, orderly chaos of the royal shipyard. It is now no longer a tree, but a commodity. It is raw potential, measured in loads in cubic feet, but it is not yet ready. Before a single piece of this oak can be fitted into the skeletal frame of a ship of the line, it must undergo a profound and lengthy transformation, a period of quiet, static preparation that is in many ways more critical than the dynamic construction of the vessel itself. This is the chapter of seasoning and shaping, a slow art governed not by the urgency of the clock, but by the patient, inexorable laws of physics and the deep, ingrained knowledge of the shipwright. The primary enemy of a wooden ship, beyond cannon fire and tempest, is the very nature of its constituent material. Wood in its living state is a vessel for water. Its cellular structure, a microscopic honeycomb of cellulose and lignin, is saturated. This green wood, if used directly, would be an engineer's nightmare. As it dries, it shrinks. It twists, it cups, it warps along the lines of its grain. Joints would loosen, planks would pull away from their caulking, and the entire structural integrity of the hull would be compromised before it ever tasted salt water. More insidiously, the moisture and residual sap within the wood provide a fertile breeding ground for the fungal spores that cause decay, the dreaded dry rot that could consume a warship from the inside out. The remedy for this inherent instability is seasoning, a simple word for a profoundly patient process. The goal is to reduce the moisture content of the timber from its green state of 50 to 100% down to a stable equilibrium with the ambient air, typically between 12 and 20%. The most common, and indeed the most trusted method, was natural air seasoning. Upon its arrival in the yard, the great logs and bulks of timber were sawn into manageable, though still immense, planks and structural pieces. This initial conversion was crucial, as it exposed more surface area to the air, beginning the process of desiccation. The converted timber was then transported to the seasoning sheds. These were vast, open-sided structures, little more than enormous roofs held up by sturdy pillars. Their design was a masterpiece of passive environmental control. The roof provided shelter from the direct, harsh rays of the sun, which could dry the surface of the wood too quickly, causing it to split and check. It also kept off the rain, which would simply resaturate the timber, undoing months of progress. The open sides, however, were paramount. They encouraged the constant, gentle circulation of air, the true agent of seasoning. This moving air would wick away the evaporated moisture from the surface of the wood, maintaining the gradient that drew more moisture out from the core. Inside these sheds, the timber was stacked with meticulous care. Each layer of planks or beams was separated from the one below it by small, uniform pieces of wood known as stickers. The placement of these stickers was a science in itself. They had to be of a consistent thickness to ensure a uniform gap, and they were placed in vertical alignment, one above the other, throughout the stack. This prevented the weight of the enormous pile from bending or distorting the timbers in the lower layers. The space created by the stickers, typically an inch or two, was the conduit for the all-important airflow, ensuring that every surface of every piece of wood was exposed to the drying currents. And then, the waiting began. The rule of thumb, passed down through generations of shipwrights, was to allow 1 year of seasoning for every inch of the timber's thickness. For the 1-inch hull planking, this was a manageable, if not insignificant, delay. But for the great structural components, the heart of the ship, the timeline was staggering. The journey of a timber, from its felling in a distant forest to its final place in the hull of a great ship, is a narrative of transformation. Here, in the sprawling, clamorous theater of the shipyard, that transformation is enacted. The air, thick with the scent of pine pitch, damp sawdust, and the mineral tang of the nearby estuary, carries the sounds of this metamorphosis. It is not a cacophony, but a symphony of measured industry, a rhythm set by the tools in the hands of the shipwright. This chapter concerns itself with those tools and the specific, time-honored techniques of their application. The process commences with the conversion of the raw log. Arriving at the yard, these immense balks of oak, elm, or pine are first surveyed, their grain, knots, and potential weaknesses assessed with an experienced eye. The first major tool to be brought to bear is the pit saw. This is not a tool for a single man, but a partnership. The pit saw itself is a long, flexible blade, sometimes 7 or 8 feet in length, with large, coarse teeth and a handle or tiller at each end. One shipwright, the top dog, stands atop the log, which is positioned over a deep pit. His role is to guide the saw, following a meticulously snapped chalk line that delineates the intended plank or beam. Below, in the pit, stands the pitman. His task is purely one of power, pulling the saw downwards on the cutting stroke. It is arduous, unpleasant work. The pitman is constantly showered in sawdust, his vision obscured, his muscles straining against the immense friction of the blade and the green wood. The rhythm is slow, a steady up and down motion, the rasp of the teeth through the fibers a constant, deep hum. The top dog steers, making minute adjustments, while the pitman provides the force. Together, they can cleave a log into planks of remarkable uniformity, a testament to collaborative effort and physical endurance. Once the timber has been roughly sawn into a more manageable form, such as a thick plank or a squared beam, the primary shaping tool of the shipwright is introduced, the adze. An adze is often confused with an axe, but its form and function are fundamentally different. Where an axe blade is aligned with the handle, for splitting, the adze blade is set at a right angle, like a hoe. The shipwright stands on the timber, feet braced apart, and swings the adze down between his legs. The curved blade bites into the wood, scooping out chips with each stroke. This process, known as dubbing, is used for fairing the curves of a ship's frames, for shaping the complex curvature of a knee, or for smoothing the wide face of a beam. There are several varieties. The shipwright's adze has a gently curved blade and a rounded, pole-like head used for hammering. The lipped adze has small projections at the corners of the blade, which help to prevent the tool from digging too deeply and marring the surface of the adjacent wood when working on a specific area. Skill with an adze is paramount. A novice can easily ruin a piece of timber or, far worse, inflict a grievous injury upon his own feet or shins. The experienced shipwright, however, moves with a fluid, rhythmic grace, the adze becoming an extension of his body. The surface left by an adze is not perfectly flat like that of a plane, but a series of shallow, overlapping scallop cuts, a distinctive and beautiful texture that speaks of a hand-wrought origin. For squaring a log without a pit saw, or for hewing a large timber to a specific dimension, the tool of choice is the broad axe. Unlike a felling axe, the broad axe typically has a single beveled blade, meaning one side is flat and the other is angled to form the cutting edge. This design allows the flat side to be run against the face of the timber, ensuring a straight, true cut. The handle, or helve, is often offset, bent away from the flat side of the blade to provide clearance for the user's knuckles. With the slipway prepared, its gentle declivity angled precisely toward the water, the process of assembly can commence. The first and most fundamental element, the very spine of the nascent vessel, is the keel. This is not a single, monolithic timber, for no tree grows to the required length and straightness to form the keel of a great ship of the line. Instead, it is a composite structure, an assembly of massive balks of oak, or, more commonly, elm, a timber favored for its resistance to rot when perpetually submerged. These individual sections, each hewn to a precise rectangular cross-section, are joined end to end through a technique known as scarfing. The most common form is the hook and butt scarf, a complex but exceptionally strong joint where interlocking hooks and flat surfaces are meticulously carved into the ends of the timbers. When brought together, these surfaces provide a vast area for load distribution, resisting both the tensional forces that seek to pull the keel apart and the compressional forces that seek to buckle it. The joints are sealed with a mixture of tar and horsehair and then fastened with a series of substantial iron bolts, driven through pre-drilled holes and clenched over iron rings or roves on the opposing side, creating a permanent, unyielding connection. Once the main keel sections are assembled into a single, continuous timber stretching the full length of the designed vessel, a false keel is often affixed to its underside. This is a sacrificial bulk, typically of fir or a similar, less durable wood. Its purpose is twofold. It provides a degree of protection to the main keel should the ship run aground, absorbing the initial impact and abrasion, and it can also contribute to the ship's lateral stability, reducing the tendency to be pushed sideways by the wind. At the two extremities of this newly laid spine, the vertical members that will define the ship's profile are raised. At the aft end is the sternpost, a formidable piece of oak, often fashioned from a single, massive timber. It is seated onto the keel through a complex series of mortise and tenon joints, reinforced by heavy iron knees or brackets, which tie it rigidly to the keel structure. Into the forward edge of the sternpost is cut a deep, angled groove known as the rabbet. This groove will eventually receive the ends of the hull planks, a detail of critical importance for a watertight seal. At the forward end, a similar but more complex structure, the stem, is erected. The stem is not a single timber, but an assembly of curved pieces, or compass timbers, scarfed together to form the elegant sweeping curve of the ship's bow. It too is joined to the keel, and it too possesses a rabbet to receive the forward ends of the hull planking. The space between the keel and the upward curving ends of the stem and sternpost is filled with a series of shaped blocks known as the deadwood, which provides a solid foundation for the subsequent framing. With the longitudinal axis of the ship now established, attention turns to its transverse skeleton. The frames, or ribs, that will give the ship its shape and strength are not carved from single pieces of wood. Such naturally curved timbers of sufficient size are exceedingly rare. Instead, each frame is an assembly of smaller, overlapping components. The process begins not in the shipyard itself, but on the vast, chalked floor of the mold loft. Here, the ship's design, as conceived by the master shipwright, is drawn out at full scale. Every curve, every line, every dimension of the hull is laid down with geometric precision. From these full-size drawings, thin wooden patterns or molds are made for every single component of every frame. These molds are then taken to the timber yard, where the shipwrights select the appropriate pieces of oak. They search for compass timbers, pieces with a natural curve in their grain that closely matches the required shape of the component. The great wooden ships, the culmination of centuries of accrued knowledge, had reached their apotheosis. The forests of the world had been shaped by the adze and the saw into floating fortresses and the engines of global commerce. An entire ecosystem, from the royal surveyor marking oaks in a quiet English wood, to the Baltic timber merchant negotiating contracts for fir masts, to the shipwright family in Portsmouth whose trade was passed from father to son, existed to support these wooden walls. The system was vast, intricate, and deeply rooted in the natural world. But the very material that gave these ships life, the timber itself, carried the seeds of its own obsolescence. The wooden world, for all its majesty, was approaching an invisible yet absolute boundary. The first and most pressing limitation was the finite supply of suitable timber. A first-rate ship of the line, such as HMS Victory, consumed an astonishing quantity of wood, estimated to be the marketable timber from over 6,000 mature trees, many of which had to be over a century old. The demand was not merely for wood, but for specific types of wood with specific properties. The keel required long, straight timbers of elm, a wood resistant to splitting and durable when submerged. The great frames, the skeleton of the ship, demanded the immense strength and resilience of oak. Critically, these frames were not straight. They followed the complex, curved lines of the hull. This necessitated the sourcing of compass timbers, trees that had grown naturally into the required shapes, their grain following the curve and thus providing maximum strength. The search for these natural crooks and bends became a specialized profession, a desperate hunt through dwindling ancient woodlands. English oak was prized above all, but by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the domestic supply was severely depleted. The Admiralty was forced to look further afield, to the oaks of North America, particularly the dense, durable live oak of the southern United States, and to the tall, straight pines and firs of the Baltic states for masts and spars. This reliance on foreign supply chains introduced geopolitical vulnerabilities and significant logistical expense. The wooden ship was, in essence, a consumer of entire forests, and the forests were finite. Beyond the crisis of supply, wood possessed inherent structural limitations. There was a practical maximum to the length of a wooden vessel, a ceiling that shipwrights continually pushed against but could not break. A wooden hull is essentially a long, hollow beam. Supported by the buoyancy of water, which is not uniform along its length, the hull is subject to immense stresses. The ends of the ship, being heavier and less supported, have a tendency to droop, while the more buoyant middle section pushes upwards. This phenomenon, known as hogging, would cause the keel to arch upwards in the middle. The opposite effect, sagging, could occur when a wave supported each end, leaving the middle to droop. Over time, these stresses would work the ship's timbers, loosening joints and opening seams. To combat this, shipwrights developed complex internal bracing. Diagonal riders, thick timbers running at an angle to the main frames, were introduced to create a lattice of reinforcement. Iron knees and brackets were increasingly used to secure deck beams to the frames, replacing the scarce and bulky wooden compass timbers. Yet these were remedial measures, additions of weight and complexity, to fight a fundamental weakness in the material itself. A wooden ship could not exceed a length of approximately 300 feet, or about 90 meters, without becoming dangerously flexible, its hull constantly in motion, its working timbers groaning under the strain. This size limitation capped the potential for cargo capacity in merchant vessels and the number of guns that could be carried by warships. The great ships of the line, the wooden walls that projected power across the oceans of the world, have long occupied a romantic space in the collective imagination. They are seen as pinnacles of craftsmanship, monuments of national will, and the very embodiment of an age of exploration and conflict. Yet, beneath this veneer of burnished wood and billowing sail, lies a deeper, more troubling ledger. It is a story not of human ingenuity alone, but of an ecological reckoning, the scale of which was unprecedented. To build these floating fortresses required a consumption of natural resources so vast, so systematic, that it permanently altered landscapes, dismantled entire ecosystems, and incurred an environmental debt that is still, in subtle ways, being paid. This is the story of that cost. The fundamental component of the wooden wall was, of course, the tree. But not just any tree. The primary species, the gold standard for the shipwrights of Northern Europe, was the oak, specifically the English oak, Quercus robur, and its close relative, the sessile oak, Quercus petrea. The preference was not arbitrary. These species possessed a unique combination of qualities honed over millennia of evolution. The timber was immensely strong, dense, and hard, yet possessed enough elasticity to absorb the shock of a cannonball without shattering. Its high tannin content gave it a natural resistance to rot, and the relentless attack of marine organisms like the gribble and the teredo worm. Most critically, the oak grew in a particular way. It did not shoot straight upwards in a uniform column. Instead, its branches grew in sprawling, irregular, and often curved patterns. For the shipwright, these natural curves were not imperfections, they were gifts. A ship is a thing of complex, compound curves. The great curved timbers that formed the ribs or futtocks of a hull, the angled pieces known as knees that supported the deck beams, and the breasthooks that reinforced the bow, these required wood with the grain following the curve. Such pieces, known as compass timber, were immensely strong, far stronger than any piece that could be artificially shaped from a straight log, a process which would inevitably sever the wood's natural grain and create points of weakness. An ideal tree for a shipwright was not a tall, straight specimen, but a mature, open-grown oak, perhaps 400 or 500 years old, whose gnarled and twisted limbs provided a preformed kit of structural components. The demand for such trees was voracious. Let us consider a single, typical vessel of the late 18th century, a 74-gun, third-rate ship of the line, the backbone of the Royal Navy. The construction of such a ship consumed, on average, between 3,000 and 4,000 mature oak trees. The vast majority of these needed to be the prized, large, centuries-old specimens. It is estimated that these 3,000 to 4,000 trees would represent the prime timber from over 50 acres of well-managed, old-growth woodland. When one considers that a navy like Britain's, at the height of its power, maintained hundreds of such vessels in service with a constant need for new construction and extensive repairs, the sheer scale of the timber requirement becomes almost incomprehensible. It was a demand that could not be met by sustainable harvesting. It necessitated the systematic dismantling of the ancient forests. The most immediate and obvious consequence was deforestation on a grand scale. The great primeval forests of Britain, which had once covered the majority of the island, were steadily consumed. These were not modern, managed plantations, but complex, multi-layered ecosystems that had existed for thousands of years. The process of extraction was itself a source of disruption. Teams of timber masters and fellers would survey a woodland, identifying and marking the specific trees whose size and shape met the exacting requirements of the naval dockyards. The great fleets of timber and sail have long since vanished from the world's oceans. Their white canvas no longer catches the trade winds, and the resonant percussion of their broadsides has faded into the quiet of historical record. The wooden walls, those colossal, intricate constructions of organic material, have been superseded by steel, by steam, by the silent, submerged leviathans of the nuclear age. Yet, to assume their influence has vanished entirely is to misunderstand the nature of legacy. The era of the wooden warship was not merely a chapter in naval history, it was a foundational period that sculpted the very framework of the modern world. Its echoes, though often faint and unrecognized, reverberate through our forests, our factories, our global economic systems, and even the administrative structures that govern our lives. The legacy of the wooden walls is not a ghost, but rather an invisible architecture supporting the edifice of the present day. One of the most profound and enduring legacies lies in the management of our natural world. The insatiable demand for naval timber, particularly high-quality oak for frames and straight-grain fir for masts, precipitated an environmental crisis on a scale previously unknown. In nations like Great Britain, the depletion of domestic forests became a matter of acute national security. The response to this crisis was not, in the long term, merely to find new sources, but to create them. This necessity gave birth to the science of silviculture, the systematic and long-term cultivation of forests. For the first time, woodlands were viewed not as a resource to be passively extracted, but as a crop to be managed across generations. Landowners and state authorities began to plant oak saplings with the explicit understanding that they would not be harvested for a century or more. They were planting for their great-grandchildren's navies. This required a paradigm shift in thinking, a transition from short-term exploitation to long-range strategic planning. Detailed surveys were conducted, land was enclosed, and planting schedules were established. The careful selection of acorns, the spacing of saplings to encourage the growth of tall, straight boles, or the gnarled, angled compass timbers needed for ships' knees, all became part of a nascent, state-sponsored science. Today, the principles of sustainable forestry, of yield management and long-term ecological planning are direct intellectual descendants of the desperate measures taken to ensure a continuous supply of heart of oak for the shipyards of the 18th century. This desperate search for timber also served as a primary engine for global exploration and the establishment of complex, international supply chains. When domestic supplies dwindled, naval powers looked abroad. The dense, old-growth forests of the Baltic region became a critical source of masts and planking, leading to intricate diplomatic and commercial relationships with powers like Sweden and Russia. The control of the Baltic trade routes was a constant point of strategic contention. Simultaneously, the vast, seemingly limitless forests of North America were opened up. The towering eastern white pines of New England were designated as mast pines, marked with the King's broad arrow and reserved exclusively for the Royal Navy, a policy that generated significant resentment among the colonists and contributed to the tensions that would eventually lead to revolution. Further afield, the unique properties of teak, a wood highly resistant to rot, and the destructive Teredo nivalis shipworm led to the establishment of major shipbuilding centers in India, such as the Wadia family shipyards in Bombay. This global network, sourcing specific materials from continents thousands of miles apart and transporting them to centralized construction sites, was a direct precursor to modern multinational logistics. And so our study of the Great Wooden Walls concludes. Thank you for joining us here on the Whispered Lore. Let the echoes of the shipwright's hammer and the whisper of wind through ancient oaks fade into a gentle hum. It is time to lower your sails and find a quiet harbor in your dreams. The story is told, the work is done. Rest well. Good night.